This is a type of commodity we're very familiar with, a loaf of bread. When you own this item, you don't just get its use value, meaning you can eat it right away, but also its exchange value. For example, you can trade that bread for a glass of water. However, for a transaction to happen, a prerequisite is that both parties must have matching needs. If not, you can also choose to sell it for money at an equivalent price. In this case, you don't have to worry about whether both sides have the same needs, but the value of that loaf of bread will vary depending on the situation. For example, if you're in the middle of a desert, its value could double. Conversely, if you're in a country where bread is abundant, then a loaf like that might be worth almost nothing. The bread is still just bread, but if you're a celebrity, the bread's exchange value can rise along with your own value. Or imagine this. In the late Middle Ages in Europe, someone had the power to manipulate public opinion, political resources, and startup capital. That person created a false ideology around this bread, turning an ordinary loaf into something associated with a vague deity that could not be seen or verified, making it hard for people to refute. After that, they used a certain amount of money to control production and distribution of this bread, intentionally controlling its circulation so that once people obtained it, they no longer thought about its use value, but instead used the bread to engage in activities that generate profit through a cycle of commodities. Money, more commodities, more money. Some even viewed it as a sacred object that signified status. And because of a product that was just bread, people fought to the point of bloodshed. Anyone who tried to reveal the truth was considered a heretic or a lunatic. At this point, we can better understand Engels' statement. People shape their circumstances, but circumstances also shape people. The class that owns the means of material production also simultaneously controls the means of mental production. From the perspective of the consumer, the part about means of production and labor relations we already skimmed through. So if we shift our perspective to the capitalist side and the workers, tracing back from the commodity to the process of production and circulation, that is the core focus of Volume 2 of Capital. In the previous part, we already understood the 3 stages and the circuit of capital. Money, with the core being different forms revolving around capital, money. This time we'll analyze starting from productive capital, which refers to the process between 2 points PP within the sphere of circulation. Compared to the previous section, you can see that the starting point of circulation has now become W, W plus W, P plus W, where W is commodity capital and W is the surplus value portion. At this stage, commodity capital forms the second stage of circulation, before entering the final stage of the cycle. However, since G and the original G serve the same function, this means G can continue to become money capital to start a new cycle. Simply put, when commodity capital W is transformed into money, GDR, the part representing capital value continues circulating in the production sphere, while the surplus value portion is converted into money to either circulate as an ordinary commodity or be hoarded. Although this money stream still originates from the capitalist, it has now gone beyond the scope of circulation of individual capital. If the concept still feels abstract, let's clarify with an example. A capitalist uses the initial capital Kong to buy 50 Vietnamese dong worth of commodity W, which includes workers' wages, raw materials, and means of production, PM. When labor combines with the means of production to create a new product, that's the production process. Eventually, the capitalist obtains commodity W worth 70 Vietnamese dong. But to complete the cycle, he needs to convert this commodity into money G. This is the W right pointing arrow G phase we just mentioned. After selling the goods for 70 Vietnamese dong, he not only recoups his initial investment of 50 Vietnamese dong, but also gains 20 Vietnamese dong in surplus value. This 20 Vietnamese dong becomes the capitalist's consumption fund. He can save it or spend it on non-productive goods and services. When he continues to use the 50, there's no Vietnamese dong as initial capital to purchase commodity, or plus, PM, and start a new round of production. This is what Marx described as simple reproduction. However, the key point at this stage is that the commodity that was produced must be fully sold and converted into money, G, or else the cycle will break. Like a game of dominoes, if something gets stuck midway, For example, only 50% is sold. Then the capitalist cannot recover the initial capital. And if the cost of raw materials increases, if material prices go up, then the original capital won't be enough to continue purchasing production materials. This forces the production scale to shrink. If at that moment, workers collectively demand higher wages and organize a strike, the entire production line would come to a halt. That's why we can more clearly understand the severe exploitative behaviors in real life. For example, when goods can't be fully sold and the capitalists can't recover their investment, they might consider delaying wages or come up with all kinds of excuses to avoid paying their workers. They might also choose to drastically cut product prices just to break even until the business cycle ends. But the cost of doing so is that they can no longer generate surplus value, meaning that entire production cycle only consumed time without generating any real profit. So in order to protect their own interests, capitalists often choose to sacrifice workers' rights. Typical examples are so-called cost-cutting measures and boosting efficiency, such as firing workers without clear justification, forcing remaining employees to work more. A task meant for 2 people is now handled by 1. And if they fail to finish it, their wages are deducted. Likewise, due to lack of capital for materials, production scale is downsized, leading to a decrease in the surplus value the capitalist can gain. In such cases, they will find every way to exploit labor, such as shortening the necessary labor time to increase surplus labor. This helps shorten the production cycle and speeds up the completion of one production round. You might wonder, what's the point of speeding it up when raw materials remain the same, but production scale is being reduced? Less surplus value is generated? The answer is, not necessarily. The key lies in the W right pointing arrow G segment. The faster the cycle completes, the quicker they gain a market advantage, thereby temporarily gaining control over pricing. Just like when you need a product and only one supplier has it available at the moment, before other capitalists can produce similar items, that product becomes scarce, and they alone dictate its price. Until other producers gradually enter the market en masse, then prices return to normal market levels. But usually by that time, the first capitalist's production and business cycle is already completed. Of course, the prerequisite here is that the market isn't saturated or facing overproduction. As for collective strikes causing production halts, this is a complex and extremely important issue. Usually, this doesn't occur in the early stages because it's a critical blow to the capitalist. Therefore, throughout the capitalist operation cycle, ideology acts as an invisible control mechanism implanted right from the first step of production and gradually reinforced with every cycle. We'll explore this part in more depth in future videos. For now, let's summarize. The reason people accept impositions is because everyone dreams that one day they'll be the one imposing it on others. And so everyone rushes ahead, full of excitement, thinking that's how freedom is achieved. If you pay close attention, you'll realize that the exploitative practices that were once severe under private ownership, our ancestors, we've stepped in to resolve and improve them. Every link in the exploitation chain above is now tightly regulated by law, from labor protection laws to regulations against unfair monopolistic practices in business. All of these today serve as invisible shields for every worker. Now let's shift our perspective once more. Previously, we focused on how capitalists exploit in production. Now let's see what they do in the marketplace. It all still revolves around one core goal: ensuring the production and consumption cycle isn't disrupted. Only the method changes. As we mentioned at the beginning, to help products sell more easily, they hire well-known individuals or high-status figures to promote them, thereby adding extra value to the product. Of course, that added value ultimately is paid for by the consumer. From this perspective, we can see that the nature of the commodity remains unchanged. But in the market, that item is now associated with status and prestige, creating a ripple effect. For example, buyers may feel, I'm using the same product as a celebrity or some aristocrat. They feel classy too, with equally fashionable taste. And when consumers feel like they're using the same product as the elite class or celebrities, it creates a kind of fake social ladder. On that basis, the capitalists begin to emphasize the product's scarcity, such as limited production, rare materials, to further raise the product's perceived value. This strategy also helps create a clear divide from competing products of the same kind. So with each buying cycle, the product is reinforced with even more status traits and scarcity traits through tactics like limited releases or mandatory bundled sales. When a product carries those traits, it gains a speculative value, meaning its value can rise depending on ownership or inventory levels. And anyone who tries to expose the true nature of this phenomenon will be rejected by that community, mocked as a peasant who knows nothing. They'll declare, this is the trend, this is fashion, this is taste, this is a cultural attitude. Note that the word culture here should be in quotation marks because it's entirely different from real culture. True culture is a means for collective human progress. It is open-minded, endures the test of time, and serves everyone. In that process, each individual contributes to development, creating a continuous and reciprocal flow of progress. In contrast, fake culture is closed off in short term, promoting division and conflict between people, thereby exploiting it to generate enormous profits that serve only a small interest group. Now, we clearly understand the concept of simple reproduction, as previously described by Marx. Therefore, the complete formula applied during this stage is as follows. If the capitalist uses part of the surplus value obtained to save or reinvest into the production cycle, then we have reproduction with accumulation and scale expansion. During this expanded reproduction process, the surplus value cannot be converted into productive capital immediately, but must go through a certain accumulation phase. The reason is that production scale expansion is limited by technical conditions, which require a minimum investment threshold. In other words, only when sufficient accumulation is reached can it take on a physical scale large enough to operate as new capital. During this accumulation phase, the surplus value temporarily lies idle in monetary form, is referred to as potential capital reserve. You can think of it as capital's potential currency. The special aspect of this form of potential capital is that it temporarily sits outside the reproduction cycle, like it's in hibernation. And this very existence reflects the internal contradiction of capitalism. On the one hand, capital constantly seeks accumulation and the continuous creation of surplus value, but on the other hand, technical constraints force the added value to undergo a dormant phase in monetary form. So how can this hibernation period be shortened? Besides converting it into regular currency, capitalists have other ways. For example, if surplus commodities are exchanged directly with precious metal producers, like gold or silver, then the surplus value is converted into gold or silver, not just regular money. Since gold and silver are assets, recognized globally for their value, but their prices vary. By location, the capitalist can exploit price differences to generate trade surplus or profit from trade. Alternatively, they may delay delivery and use credit or fixed assets as collateral. In that case, the surplus product is already capitalized, no longer needing to be converted into cash, and turn it into a bond, that is, a certificate of ownership representing future equivalent value. In other words, they turn it into a financial asset that carries future ownership value. This marks a step out of the production cycle of industrial capitalism and into the realm of financial capitalism. This type of financial asset still has capitalist traits, but it operates outside the original cycle of material production. And of course, this is already very close to today's modern economy. Though this is not the focus of today's video, I wanted to expand on it for better understanding. From Volume 1 until now, we've still been focusing on industrial capitalism, not delving deeply into financial capitalism. These two models differ in nature. Up to this point, we haven't yet considered factors like rent, taxes, exchange rates, or interest rates, complex variables in economics. Lastly, I'd like to clarify that I'm a philosophy blogger. In-depth analysis of modern economics and finance is not my area of expertise. I mainly approach things from a philosophical angle. Admitting that you're not skilled in certain fields is nothing to be ashamed of. Therefore, for specific analysis on economics or finance, I encourage you, if you're truly interested, to refer to public courses from both local and international universities. Nowadays, there's no lack of information. What's lacking is focus, the ability to filter and utilize information for learning. A bit of entertainment news might make you feel good for a moment because it triggers quick emotions. But looking deeper, they barely contribute at all to building a better version of yourself. Of course, I'm not denying or completely criticizing such content. They can also serve as a way to relieve stress. What matters is recognizing the two sides of everything and adjusting according to your state of mind. Back to the main topic. Once accumulation reaches a certain level, a shift will occur. Two extremes might happen, either full consumption or full investment. However, the long-term trend always follows a balance ratio between the two. To put it simply, the capitalist will use part of the surplus value for personal living expenses and reinvest the rest into production. In extreme cases, they might either spend it all or invest it all. But generally speaking, they will still choose to invest a portion to continue the cycle of production. At that point, the production cycle will resume on a larger scale with greater value. The expanded capital enters a second cycle, starting from point P. But this time, P is now a larger productive capital than before. However, we must keep in mind, this cycle is not the same as the GG cycle we've studied. In the GG cycle, we see a direct increase in monetary value. But in the PP cycle, the increase in value is completed. During the production stage itself, PVP, the circulation stage, WG, is only the transformation of the value form. The flow of surplus value, in this case, is separate from the capital cycle. And through the process GV, we also understand that as capital increases, its value composition changes as well. The value of means of production, PM, increases, while the value of labor, V, decreases, sometimes even decreasing in absolute terms. By this point, you've grasped the full process of the productive capital cycle. However, you may still feel that one piece is missing, namely, accumulation and the reserve fund. In other words, this refers to the temporarily stored portion of money in the form of surplus value. Simply put, this is the cash form of accumulated capital, a sort of contingency fund. In case the transition from W to GR is prolonged, or the conversion from commodity to money is delayed, or when raw material prices suddenly rise, then this reserve fund replaces a quarter of the money capital to keep production running. However, this reserve fund is not the same as the funds used for payments within the PP cycle. Those payments are a built-in function of operating capital, monetary capital, that's active in the cycle. By contrast, the reserve fund still lies outside the circuit, not yet transformed into productive capital. It's only used when something goes wrong. For example, when the production cycle doesn't go as planned. At that point, the reserve fund is activated to keep the capital cycle from being interrupted. And with that, we reach the end. The entire cycle of productive capital in this period has now been clearly summarized and laid out. The full formula for the entire process has also been completed. Now, when we revisit the example of the loaf of bread from the beginning, you'll likely have a deeper understanding. You'll realize that demand can, in fact, be created. And the purpose of creating this demand is mainly to keep the cycle going, to maximize profit from commodities. At this point, the means begins to dictate the ends. Something that used to be just an intermediary tool, money now becomes the ultimate destination.